This episode is brought to you by WeatherGuard Lightning Tech. At WeatherGuard, we support design engineers and make lightning protection easy. You're listening to the Struck Podcast. I'm Dan Blewett.
I'm Alan Hall.
And here on Struck, we talk about everything aviation, aerospace engineering, and lightning protection. All right, welcome back to the Struck Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dan Blewett. On today's episode, first we're going to chat a little bit about the Atlas V rocket, which is carrying Boeing's Starliner capsule, some of the issues that they've had going back to the hangar recently. We'll talk about Airbus, just 2 jet sales in July, a little bit concerning. Also, back into some squabbles with Qatar Airlines over some fuselage issues. We'll talk about FAA's approval of the first general aviation Heads Up Display, which came back in June. DHL has added some electric aircraft with a new order from Aviation. We'll talk about Lilium. They've also got a big order and a terrifying Russian hoverbike crash as they were testing in Dubai recently. Good grief, how that pilot is alive. Alan, we'll get to that later, but tell me a little bit about the Atlas V rocket. Boeing's had some trouble here, and it looks like they're going back to the drawing board a little bit. Are they playing catch up to SpaceX and Blue Origin, all this? I mean, what's the mission here as well?
Well, they're definitely playing catch up to SpaceX, and their goal is to put crews up to the International Space Station, and SpaceX is doing that right now. And both SpaceX and Boeing were on the same pathway in terms of delivering people into orbit. The difference has been is since SpaceX got through the initial unmanned launch and docking procedures and came back down and then got the green light to then fly. Well, I think they're up to 3 missions right now that have been manned to the space station. So that's a pretty good track record for SpaceX. Boeing has been unable to really get off the launch pad. The earlier flight with the Starliner had a software glitch in terms of timing. And so the spacecraft never made it up to orbit, if you remember. And that ended up costing the head of Boeing his job, which is at the time didn't seem possible, but it was just an accumulation of things that was sort of the last straw. After that, they had a reorganization and they've changed management. But the Starliner still seems to be in trouble. And if you see the latest news about it, there's not a lot of details, but they had the spacecraft out on the launch pad, essentially ready to go, and we're doing some pre-flight checks, and they had 13 different valves not open when commanded to open. Now that seems like that's a lot, right? And from the engineering perspective, you're like, holy heck, we got a big problem. Because those valves sound like they're basically the same valve in the propulsion system that didn't open when commanded. And from the latest news stories going back and forth, they said it wasn't a corrosion issue, wasn't necessarily a degradation issue inside the valves. It was something else, and they weren't even sure yet, or at least not publicizing what the issue was. But they were trying to command them. They actually brought the capsule back indoors, and we're trying to command those valves electrically, mechanically, and thermally, something like that. Like they're trying to nudge them into opening, which to me doesn't sound like a great thing to be doing under NASA's watch. Like you don't want to be, you don't want to be trying out stuff when your customer is over your shoulder. That should have been figured out months ago, maybe years ago. So this is just bizarre. This whole scenario is bizarre because the feeling was a couple weeks ago is Boeing is going to get back on track. That was the feeling, and then this happens. So Dan, do you think that NASA is going to be feeling real good about this right now?
No, not with them like actively tinkering and trying to just like jam it into working. Yeah, it seems pretty. I'm sure it's not as haphazard as that, but it seems a little suspect.
It can be, right? On spacecraft, anytime you touch a spacecraft, there's a piece of paper, right? And there's already this approval process to touch it and to modify it and to open a panel. There's paperwork to close it. So what it appeared from an outsider's point of view is that they're not trying to do anything to the spacecraft that would involve generating more paperwork besides creating a little test procedure to make the valves open and close a couple times and see if they could goose them into running without disassembling the spacecraft. Because once you start down that pathway that's disassembling, there's a lot of oversight review. And also as you reassemble, there's a lot of oversight and review. And there's also the likelihood of having some error, because once you're out in those site buildings near the launch pads, it's not the easiest place in the world to work. So you got to wonder if this is really starting to tumble into major Boeing problem and how they're going to address it. To me, somebody's head's going to roll on this one, Anderson or not, just because that program has so much visibility, and SpaceX is, as we've seen, getting their larger spacecraft up on the launch pad. It's going to have a launch here pretty soon, which is really going to stick a fork into Boeing in terms of just capability. So it's just this whole scenario is so bizarre, and you would never have expected Boeing to be in this situation, which is unimaginable, really unimaginable at this point.
Yeah, it seems just in general that they've had lots of issues after, getting many of their planes out there. They just recall, another problem. It just seems like they've, I don't know, the word embattled seems like it fits Boeing in the last couple of years, right? Starting with the 737 MAX and seemingly with lots and lots of different aircraft. Maybe, I don't know, is this just that they're more often in the news cycle, or is this really that there's seems to be more problems with Boeing manufacturing?
That's a really good question, because the first thing that gets pointed at is culture. And that's a very hard term to describe, because they're in a large company like that. What is culture? What does that even mean? When I used to work in aerospace at large aerospace companies, they would use the word, our culture is this, our culture is quality, blah, blah, blah. And the engineers and staff would look around at one another and go, I have no idea what they're talking about. And because it's like your immediate family and your extended family sort of situation. Like, what's going on around you. That's around you and your immediate family. You have a pretty good idea, what your mom and dad are doing, what your brothers and sisters are doing. But then you kind of get down to the second cousins. You're not really sure what's going on out there. Well, the same thing exists in any large organization. And if you're building a spacecraft or an airplane, there's a lot of second cousins in that group that you just don't have any idea what they're up to, what they're doing, and how are you going to control that is the kicker. And to label that as culture, I'm not sure that is what it is, as much as just bad luck. Do you just mark it up to bad luck at this point? Or like, how can the CEO actually have any control over that? Right?
Yeah, I mean, the CEO can't, but I was actually looking at, I can't remember why, but I was rolling down the list of murder rates for countries in the United States. And as you get down to the bottom where there's like effectively zero for lots and lots of countries, mostly in Asia and Europe, you start to wonder, like, why is it effectively zero in many of these countries? But then if you look at the Caribbeans, Latin America, it's consistently very, very high. And so even though there's millions of people in each of these countries, you have to start to say, well, like in the safest countries in the world, there's got to just be like every household, every county, every province, whatever, there's just enough figureheads who say this is how we are and this is what's not tolerated, and this is, our like, it has to run really, really deep in instilling those values in people. If you call not murdering people value, but yeah, the CEO certainly can't control a 100,000 person company, but if their mission is well, I don't know if indoctrinated is the word in a positive way, but if all of his, next level managers and then the managers below them and the managers below them down the pyramid all instill and really enforce a certain standard, then it can trickle down to every little team, like you said, where the door engineering team and the cowling engineering team, they can all still the message gets to everyone, because it clearly, I mean, South Korea has effectively 0 murders per year, or 1 murder per 100,000 people, not per year, per 100,000 people. And it's got to just trickle down to everyone, right? Essentially from some unified spirit or values that all of them have. It's a really interesting thing to think about, especially as you start thinking about violence in America and South America. I think I was reading about Venezuela and Brazil, actually. That's where it came from. It came from this podcast. I was reading about the EVTOLs and how they're valuable in Brazil because violence is so high. And they've talked about the murder rate in Brazil and the violent crime rate and how crazy it is. That's why people don't really want to drive around if they can stay in the air above the violence. That's where they get this. That's where it was. So anyway, somehow that tied back in here. But yeah, it's a good point. I mean, big companies seem like they're impossible to control, and it is for one person. But I don't know. You think it's just got to be a long-standing thing, and maybe Boeing used to have that culture of workmanship, but maybe it's slowly eroded, and now it's not there. It's hard to know.
Well, you really raised a couple of good points here, because I was recently watching again some of the Steve Jobs comments on hiring, and early on in the Macintosh world, Apple got into a big world of hurt on the people they were hiring, and how that drove sort of generationally in the company problems of quality and performance. And he felt like he needed to remove whole sections of middle management out so that the technical leaders could then also have to be managers, because they were the best people to be on those roles, instead of a dedicated person that manages the humans that are involved in the group. It's someone who's extremely knowledgeable on what's going on and feels like no one else can do it. So they step into that role, which I kind of want. And I think you also raised a second point, which is culturally or education wise, are we slipping a little bit? Because if you listen to Elon Musk and his hiring style, they don't really try to find B players. They're really trying to find A players and people that have taken on responsibility. And that's sort of a different way of looking about it from an engineering organization. When you apply to a Tesla or a SpaceX, or name the 50 companies they have running right now, what they're looking for is that you've taken a project and you've run with that project as the lead. Like, you own that bit. So there's this little personal responsibility with that. And it's an interview question of, explain to me how that project ran. Explain to me what it did. Because what they do is they're fishing out the people that were just peripheral to that project, to the people that were core. And they hire the people that were core and taking them in. And in a Boeing situation, because you need a lot of people, maybe they're just kind of getting, in theory, watered down, is what we would say in engineering. You hope that that's not the case, but it's starting to feel like that, because there's something going on within engineering that leads to these sort of defects. And I know SpaceX has kind of gotten to that situation before. Obviously, they've had a lot of crashes in their rockets, and they've taken that as part of their development process, but it also may weed out employees that can't really do the job. It's really fascinating time.
Well, moving on to a Boeing competitor, Airbus has sold just 2 jets in July. This reporting by Forbes, and Qatar Airlines is once again very unhappy with them. So the CEO of Qatar Airways, Akbar Al-Bakr, has basically said there's a degradation of the fuselage surface just below the paint on some A350s. And they said it's serious, and they're pretty unhappy with it. I think they've had to ground some aircraft. I mean, is this pretty common that these fights kind of get into the media cycle? No,
not until they get to really the lawyer stage, where they're starting to sue one another, because you don't want to bring the press into it. You have to live with these people, right? It's like getting upset at your local coffee shop guy there's someone you have to deal with all the time. So you want to have a decent relationship. You don't want to badmouth them to the newspaper if you can avoid it. Yeah, right. And for whatever reason, Qatar is having a big problem with paint. And they're really upset with, it sounds like a paint adhesion issue, which to me sounds like either some type of UV degradation of the composite system or some sort of issue with the lightning protection system on the airplane that is degraded. And then paint is just the visual sign that something is wrong. Now, the problem, if there is really a problem, and it looks like there's a problem because there's so many voices involved with this at the moment, but if you're going to try to quote unquote fix a paint adhesion problem on a composite airplane, that's really difficult because the thing you don't want to do is start grinding away at the surface of a composite airplane because you're going to have manufacturing escapes and you're going to damage the structure as you're trying to clean it and all that. Versus an aluminum airplane, there's just a lot of ways to clean it and repaint it and fly it on out. So they're kind of an impasse. And obviously, Airbus hasn't always been that busy in the summertime anyway. I'm not taking too much into that, but these fights are getting with these airlines are just bizarre. And my guess is it's mostly COVID related, but we shall see.
Well, do you think I mean, you said obviously you want to keep it out of the press, especially if it ends up being a legal issue, but is this something that they want to press Airbus to maybe get them to settle or pay for it just to quiet it down so it's out of the press? I mean, could it be that kind of tactic?
Oh, sure. And the rumor is that the airline had deposited an airplane at Airbus's facilities and left it on the tarmac. And that rarely happens. I can't remember a time where that happened. But that doesn't happen very often. It'd be like if you bought a General Motors car, like taking it to Detroit and drop it in the CEO's parking space and saying, here it is. That's what it means. It's bold. It's really bold, right? Because there's a lot of people between the airline and the CEO. There's a lot of sales staff, support people between those two. So you've basically run over everybody on the airline side and on Airbus's side to get to the head of the company and to basically, bang on the guy's desks and say, I need this fixed. I'm not getting the support I need, and I'm not going to take it anymore. That's what it says. It's a bold move. And I that's like glass measures. You must be really upset to get to that point. And obviously they're upset. How Airbus deals with it, though, is going to be super quiet. Airbus will typically, and Boeing will do the same thing. They will never say anything in the press about an airline customer unless they haven't paid. But this one is going to be done in conference rooms and negotiation tables for the next couple of months. I just wonder why Airbus doesn't say, oh, all right, screw it, we'll just repaint it. That seems like a simple solution, but maybe it's deeper. Maybe there's something that Airbus is dealing with that they don't have an answer for yet, or maybe they disagree on that there is a paint issue. Then it's Airbus, but Airbus really can't say anything here. That's the problem. Airbus just seems like they're getting bludgeoned in the press, and they can't fight back. You have really no way to fight back.
So the FAA has approved a general aviation heads-up display. This was back in late June. Alan, this seems like something that would be like a no-brainer, wouldn't seem like a big deal. But obviously I know, I've learned here from you that everything in a plane, whether it's just like the, your elbow rest or your arm rest, is going to go through certification and quite a lot of testing. So why is this new heads-up display such a big deal?
It just provides situational awareness to the pilot without raising your head up and down. So if you can imagine when you're driving your car, how often do you look at the instrument panel, look at your speed? You don't tend to do that very often because you have things around you providing relative input. Like you kind of know, you can hear the engine roar, you can look outside, you can see other cars going with you. And you don't really look down, up and down a lot, up and down, up and down, up and down. On an airplane, you have to look up and down a lot, right? Because there's so much information on the instrument panel that tells you altitude, airspeed, direction, whether you're trimmed or not, all these different pieces, what airport you're heading to, what the frequency at the next airport is, all the stuff is happening, and it's not really the easiest thing to pick up human-wise. It's not the easiest interface. So if you can put that information in front of the pilot, that makes the chances of error go down. And it's surprising because some of these heads-up displays that are going on Part 25 airplanes like airliners have really have the potential to really decrease accidents by upwards of 20%. That's a lot in consideration that most aircraft accidents are pilot-induced somehow. So if you can give the pilot more information and provide a much more stable platform to interpret that information, there goes some safety risks are going to go away. It's a great move, right? The problem, Dan, has been, like, as you can well imagine, like you were just saying with the armrest, like I got to have an armrest that has to go through some testing. If you put up something that has flight information in front of the pilot, it's got to be right all the time through all kinds of environments, because an error there could lead to an accident. So that means the cost of the project goes way up, and the cost of the equipment itself is not cheap either. And the reliability has to be there. So the cost just kind of spiral. There's really nothing to do about it because it's a critical system. So the systems get expensive. And that's why it has been an impediment to getting them certified. It's not that much that they haven't existed. They had them in cars since the 90s, maybe even earlier. But we haven't really put them in Part 23s at all, small airplanes at all, because of the cost. And do I want to go buy a $30,000, $50,000 install on an airplane that, I can fly reasonably well and feel very safe in? Yeah, maybe. I mean, if I'm flying in the mountains at nighttime, I sure as heck want to have that. Or if I'm flying from places where it may be foggy and I can put the camera system with it, I definitely want to have it. So it's going to. The FAA is making a lot of changes in Part 23, and this is one of them. They're trying to lessen the requirements of certification for items that can add significant safety, and this is one of them. So we'll see. We're going to have to kind of watch and monitor how this goes over the next couple of years to see how much safety improvement it does create, because it should.
All right, so moving on to our EVTOL and electric segment. First up on the docket is aviation. So they've signed a deal with DHL, which is obviously one of the top three. I don't know if you can't count Amazon in there now, but one of the top logistics and package delivery companies in the world. DHL Express is adding 12 of Aviation's e-cargo plane, which has a payload of 2,600 pounds, range of 815 kilometers, and they say it will recharge in 30 minutes or less between flights, which is pretty amazing. I mean, just hearing that. So, Alan, where do you fall on this? I mean, I know it seems like a practical move to start with a lot of these electric vehicles, in the sort of commercial sector where you don't have to worry about passengers, right? Just the pilot and a bunch of corrugated cardboard. But I mean, do you think this is a good move for DHL and we'll see more like this?
I think you will. I think the cargo routes make a lot of sense. There's a lot of shorter runs, relatively shorter runs that are being serviced by sort of the caravans, the Cessna caravans of the world, and the Sky Courier that Beech/Textron/Cessna are building at the moment that they're doing for FedEx. But there's definitely a space in there just because of the timing of the routes, and what the downtime is, and that you're not trying to, like a 737 for Southwest Airlines, where it lands and 20 minutes later it wants to be back in the air for another 3-hour flight. That's not something an electric aircraft's going to be able to do. But an electric aircraft sure can do scheduled service that's 2-3 runs a day. And you want to do it inexpensively, and what the cargo sizes are generally out of a particular city, absolutely. That would make an infinite amount of sense if the cost is right. If the cost of the aircraft is right, it can make a lot of sense. And I think DHL, like we're going to see from a lot of airline operators, are just putting their toe in the water to see how well, this is going to work, and is it really going to be the half-hour turnaround that they say? And is it going to produce an overall cost savings on the maintenance side, which is what we're talking about in downtime, because there should be less downtime in flying these aircraft. And the efficiency is going to be up there also. You would think just because getting rid of fuel changes and using battery changes the way you can make the aerodynamics work on the aircraft. And George Bai's been doing that at Bai Aerospace. And I think they were one of the really first ones to figure out, because they were flying it, that once you don't need fuel, you have to store fuel in tanks, you can make the aircraft, and the motor's a lot smaller. That's the other part. The motor's a lot smaller. That you can make the aircraft very sleek and efficient in the air. Those are benefits you just can't do on a regular piston airplane today. So this is going to be a stepping stone. I think it really is going to be a stepping stone. The Joby announcement, they're supposed to be at the New York Stock Exchange Thursday, when this episode releases. So that will be an interesting one too, to see how the market reacts to the electric vehicle stuff, because electric vehicles are coming. It's question is how much impact are they going to have?
So moving on, speaking of this adoption of aircraft, Lilium is inking a big deal with Azul, which is a major carrier in Brazil, the founder of JetBlue here in the United States, also one of the founders of Azul. But Lilium is sending 220 of their 7-seat Lilium jets, which retail for around $4 million a piece, it will look like. And so that's going to end up being around $1 billion deal for Lilium. And this is just, I think, the latest in a bunch of strings of these big orders of companies, like United and all these others, taking a chance on future delivery of some of these EVTOLs. So, Lilium has a relatively unique aircraft compared to some of the others. It's got all those sort of mini ducted fans. Is that how you would characterize them, Alan?
Right. Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, so a lot different than similar overall, white, sleek, very futuristic, but a lot of the little ducted fans rather than the propellers. What sticks out to you about this deal between Lilium and Azul?
Well, I think they're really trying to get into the helicopter market in like Sao Paulo, which is a big helicopter market, because there is sort of two worlds, economically speaking, of the millionaires, billionaires, I would assume, that do fly around in helicopters right now from the tops of buildings. And if you can do that less expensively, or maybe you can make some sort of like Uber event in Brazil or Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, then yeah, there's probably a place to pull that off, because there are pockets of extreme wealth in Brazil that you could tap for that marketplace. I think that the real question, and Dan, you really pointed this out, it's a difference between the design of what Lilium is doing and what literally everyone else who's a serious contender in that electric aircraft market space are doing. Ducted fans versus propellers. And the ducted fan, every other company that has started ducted fans has pulled away from it because of transition issues. As you translate from vertical flight to horizontal flight, there's some flight things in there about the way that a ducted fan works, and are you getting the airflow it needs, and do you stall the aircraft because of that transition standpoint. So it's like the flight laws are not great on ducted fans, but Lilium's still going down that route, and rightly so, as we're going to talk about it shortly. There's less propellers flying by your head, so to speak. Everything's much smaller and seems less threatening. And from a market standpoint and a consumer standpoint, I like that. I think that's the right. It looks safe, right? And a lot of aircraft have to do with the way that they look. A lot of aircraft programs have failed because of the way that they appear, and Lilium would be no different than any other. So the question is, has Lilium done something technically that they've overcome that the other electric aircraft companies have decided not to even to go after? I think the jury's still out on that right now. But I think, having read up on Brazil, isn't Brazil the right marketplace? I've always thought Brazil would be a great marketplace for any electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft because they had that, they're already sort of set up for it. Well, the U.S. isn't really set up for that, and they don't have routes set up when we're flying from skyscraper to skyscraper. That's not America, and we just don't tend to do that. But Brazil, it's a thing.
It is, and I listened to the How I Built This podcast with the JetBlue founder, and he talked about at the end about Azul and how Brazil just has tons and tons of little towns that had no airport, that just didn't have flights to them. So Azul has done really well selling lots of these short flights connecting the entire country. And so when you think of it like that, I think this makes a ton of sense for them because that already seems like their sweet spot, where they're getting people in the air and mobile who otherwise couldn't have been. And so I think this is definitely an evolution. Like you said, or like we alluded to earlier, the violence in Brazil, unfortunately, is also going to make this an attractive option for people who want to travel by helicopter and not put their families at risk if they're, potentially a kidnapping candidate or whatever you'd call it. That's probably, a kidnapping risk. Yeah. So it does seem like that's a country that's really built for this, and that they'll give it a good hard try to see how it works. So yeah. And speaking of danger, we'll link to this video in the description, but we're going to close here with this Russian hoverbike. And this is a funny article by New Atlas because one of the lines, they say, "We thought it was just the vehicle for aspiring amputees," is a quote from this article. It's literally, if you imagine a person standing up and looks like 1 foot or 18-inch propellers on all four sides of their legs, like within a foot of each leg. And then you just like hit go and go up. But this guy was testing it in Dubai, crashed, fell backwards, and somehow the propellers shattered on the ground before they could cut him in half. And then it tipped all the way over on top of him, and the other one somehow missed him. Alan, I mean, this man, does he know how lucky he is to be alive? He must, but why was he up there in the first place? Good grief.
Well, there's a lot of it's sort of Wright brotherish in a sense. When you watch the early aircraft world in 1908, 10, 12, 15, somewhere, and they're kind of pre-World War I, the aircraft designs were nuts, and the pilots were in peril all the time. And obviously a lot of pilots died in those times because the aircraft weren't reliable. The engines weren't reliable. The structure wasn't reliable. The propellers weren't reliable. None of it was reliable. And so now we're in that sort of phase again of we can make something relatively simple that'll lift us off the ground, but to make it reliable takes a lot more money to do. And so therefore you get these designs that are sketchy, in my opinion, safety-wise. Not that they couldn't fly, I'm sure.
Well, this one has zero margin for error. Zero margin for error. I mean, if you fall off one side, and what happened, I guess, on this flight was that some system that helped stabilize it started, I said it was a barometer or something, and the thing just started bucking like a mechanical bull, and then it went down from like 100 feet. And I mean, this would have been a gruesome, even if it's just maimed and not killed, it just would have been gruesome because these propellers are literally surrounding his body. No ducts, no guards, like nothing. It's just buzzing right there. Whew.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you're right that this was a lucky break for the industry in general, even though people would be like, well, that doesn't represent all of us. It's still going to would be a black eye for EVTOLs.
Oh, sure. I think this is why a lot of EVTOL flights are so hidden right now, is if they ever have a crash, it's just going to really hurt stock prices in the industry.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Struck Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, and check out the description below for more information about any of the topics we covered here today. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you here next week on Struck. Strike Tape, WeatherGuard Lightning Tech's proprietary lightning protection for radomes, provides unmatched durability for years to come. If you need help with your radome lightning protection, reach out to us at weatherguardaero.com. That's weatherguardaero.com.